The glow from the wall of monitors was the only light in the room, painting Kazuki's face in a cold, blue hue. Each screen was a silent window into a different part of his world, a world he had meticulously constructed, controlled, and fortified. He sat in a high-backed leather chair that didn't creak, his posture as rigid as the steel beams reinforcing the mansion's walls. His gaze, however, was fixed on a single feed, the playroom. It was a large, sunlit space filled with the finest wooden toys and softest rugs, yet it always felt empty. In the center of the frame, a small boy sat on the floor, his back to a vibrant, hand-painted mural of a forest. This was Haru, his son, 8 years old and encased in a silence more profound than the soundproofed walls of this room. Kazuki watched the boy's hands as they stacked colored blocks with a precision that was both admirable and heartbreaking. There was no joy in the act, only a quiet, methodical purpose. The silence wasn't a choice. It was a cage Haru had built around himself 2 years ago, the day the world had stolen his mother and his voice in one violent screech of tires. The doctors called it traumatic mutism, compounded by severe auditory damage. Deafness. Silence. The words were a death sentence for a child's laughter. Then, a new figure entered the frame. Lena. She was young, 21, and moved with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with the sterile opulence of the house. Her dark blue maid's uniform was immaculate, a stark contrast to the warmth in her eyes that Kazuki had noted with suspicion during her interview. He watched her pause at the doorway, her hands clasped behind her back. She didn't call out to Haru, she knew better. Instead, she entered the room and began to dust a bookshelf on the far side, her movements slow and deliberate. Kazuki leaned forward, his fingers steepled under his chin. He had hired her against his better judgment, against the advice of his security chief. But there was something in her application, in her quiet demeanor, that had resonated with a part of him he thought long dead. Now, he watched her through the unblinking eye of a hidden lens, a guardian ghost in his own home, searching for any sign of threat, any hint of deceit. He was a man who trusted no one, and he would protect his silent son from a world that had already taken too much. The memory was a phantom limb, an ache that flared in the quiet moments. It was always the same. The scent of rain on asphalt, the glint of shattered glass under a streetlight, the hollow echo in the mansion that had once been filled with his wife's music. Akari had been the light, the sound, the vibrant color in his monochrome existence. She had understood the darkness he inhabited, the world of unspoken loyalties and brutal necessities, but she had never let it touch their home. She had built a sanctuary of warmth and laughter for Haru, a place where the shadows of his father's life could not reach. The accident had shattered that sanctuary. It hadn't been an attack, not a rival family's retaliation. It was something far more mundane, and therefore more cruel. A drunk driver, a blind corner, a moment of senseless, random violence. Kazuki had been 1,000 miles away, closing a deal that cemented his power, when the call came. He had returned to a world muted, the music silenced forever. Haru had been in the car. Physically, he was almost unscathed, but the shock, the sight of his mother, the deafening roar of the impact, it had slammed a door deep inside him. The doctors had explained it with clinical detachment. The auditory nerves were damaged, but the silence, the utter refusal to make a sound, was a fortress of trauma. A child's mind protecting itself from a memory too horrific to process. Kazuki had responded in the only way he knew how. He built a fortress of his own. The mansion became a high-security compound. The staff were vetted with an intensity bordering on paranoia. And the cameras went up, dozens of them, their lenses becoming his surrogate eyes. He could not heal his son, he could not bring back his wife, but he could control the environment. He could eliminate every conceivable threat. He had created the safest, most sterile prison in all of Tokyo, a gilded cage where his son was protected from everything except the silence that screamed within its walls. He poured his grief and helplessness into vigilance, mistaking observation for connection and control for care. He watched Haru for hours, learning the subtle language of his son's posture, the the flicker of his eyes, the tension in his small shoulders. He knew his son's sadness, but he did not know how to reach it. Lena did not try to breach the silence with noise. Her first week was a study in quiet presence. She would clean the playroom while Haru was there, her movements a soft, rhythmic hum in the background. She never approached him directly, never tried to force an interaction. She simply shared his space, a calm and steady orbit around his silent world. On the third day, Kazuki watched from his command center as she finished her work and, instead of leaving, sat on the floor a dozen feet away from Haru. She didn't look at him. She pulled a small, worn paperback from her apron pocket. The camera zoomed in. It was a beginner's guide to Japanese Sign Language. Kazuki felt a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps. Pity. Did this girl think a few clumsy gestures could undo what batteries of specialists had failed to achieve? He watched as she practiced, her fingers forming awkward, uncertain shapes in the air. The sign for tree. The sign for blue. The sign for friend. Haru, for his part, seemed not to notice. He continued his solitary game with his blocks, his focus absolute. Yet, Kazuki, a man who had built an empire on reading the slightest tells, noticed a change. The boy's movements, usually so fluid, had become infinitesimally slower. His head, usually bent low over his work, was angled just a fraction of a degree towards her. He was aware. He was watching her from the corner of his eye. The next day, Lena did something different. She sat in the same spot, but this time, she began to hum. It was a low, gentle melody, a simple lullaby with no words. It was technically useless. The boy could not hear it. But Kazuki watched, mesmerized, as Haru's hands stilled completely. The block he was holding rested on the top of his tower. He did not turn, but his entire body seemed to be listening with a sense other than hearing. He was feeling the vibration through the polished wooden floor, a subtle resonance that cut through his soundless world. Lena hummed for 10 minutes, her eyes soft, fixed on nothing in particular. She was not performing for the boy. She was simply offering a piece of herself to the quiet room. When she finished, she stood, gave a slight, respectful bow to the back of Haru's head, and left. Haru remained motionless for a full minute before slowly, carefully, placing the final block on his tower. Weeks bled into a month. The surveillance room became Kazuki's sanctuary and his torment. He watched the silent ballet unfold daily between the American Maid and his son. Lena's presence had become a fixed point in Haru's rigid routine. Her quiet humming was a daily ritual. Her clumsy attempts at sign language were a constant, gentle offering. She never seemed discouraged by the lack of response. Her patience was a force of nature, as persistent and unassuming as the tide. Kazuki saw the small changes that no one else would notice. He saw Haru begin to orient his play so that he was facing her, no longer giving her his back. He saw the boy's eyes follow her as she moved around the room. One afternoon, Lena was practicing the sign for flower near the large window overlooking the garden. She held her hand up, fingers together, then bloomed them outwards. She did it again and again, her brow furrowed in concentration. On the screen, Kazuki saw Haru mimic the gesture, his own small hand opening and closing in his lap, a secret, silent echo of her movement. A tightness seized Kazuki's chest. It was a feeling he couldn't name, a complex cocktail of hope, resentment, and a profound, aching jealousy. This stranger, this girl from a world away, was building a bridge to his son across an ocean of silence, and she was doing it with nothing more than patience and a cheap paperback book. He, with all his power, all his resources, could only watch from a distance, a king in a castle of his own making, unable to reach his own heir. He began to review the footage from her off hours, searching for, he wasn't sure what, a flaw, a motive, an explanation for her impossible patience. He saw her in her small, neat room, reading, writing letters home, meticulously polishing her shoes. Her life was as quiet and orderly as her work. There was no secret, no hidden agenda. There was only a persistent, gentle sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Her simple, unwavering kindness was, in itself, the most suspicious thing about her. In his world, nothing was ever so simple. Everyone had an angle. Kindness was a currency, a tool, a mask. He could not decipher hers, and it unnerved him more than any overt threat. The internal conflict was a cold fire in Kazuki's gut. He had spent his life cultivating an image of impenetrable control. His emotions were tools, to be deployed with strategic precision, never to be felt. Grief was a weakness. Fear was a liability. Love was a vulnerability to be shielded at all costs. Now, this young woman, with her soft humming and her gentle hands, was dismantling his defenses from the inside out, without ever laying a finger on them. She was showing him that his entire philosophy of protection was a lie. He had surrounded Haru with guards, technology, and impenetrable walls, believing that safety was the ultimate expression of love. But he was only protecting the boy's body. Lena, with her patient silence, was tending to his soul. Every time he watched her on the monitors, he felt the foundations of his world shift. He saw her leave a perfectly ripe strawberry on Haru's play table, signing the word "sweet" before she left the room. He watched as Haru, after a long, contemplative pause, picked it up and ate it. It was the first fruit the boy had eaten willingly in months. The victory was not his. The connection was not his. He was a spectator to his own son's slow, tentative re-engagement with the world. A bitter resentment began to fester. Why her? What gave her the right to succeed where he had failed so completely? He was the boy's father. He was the one who had held him through the night after the accident, the one who had scoured the globe for the best doctors, the one who had burned his wife's memory into his own heart like a brand. Yet he was the ghost behind the glass, and she was the one in the room. He considered firing her. The thought was a sharp, satisfying flash of power. He could remove her with a single word, restore the sterile order of his controlled world. But the thought was followed by a chilling image. The playroom, empty except for Haru, the silence returning, heavier and more absolute than before. He realized, with a jolt that felt like physical pain, that he could not send her away. He was trapped. His son's well-being, the fragile flicker of hope that had begun to kindle in the darkness, was inextricably linked to this woman he barely knew and fundamentally did not trust. His control was an illusion. He was no longer the master of this house. He was a hostage to a quiet maid and the hope she carried in her hands. The revelation came not from an intercepted phone call or a background check, but from a single, unguarded moment captured in high definition. It was late. Lena's duties were done for the day. Kazuki was in his surveillance chair, a glass of whiskey untouched on the console beside him, cycling through the day's footage with a familiar, restless energy. He switched to the live feed from the hallway near the staff quarters. Lena was walking back to her room, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion. She paused at her door, fumbling in her apron pocket. She pulled out not her key, but a small, silver locket on a delicate chain. Kazuki zoomed the camera in, the powerful lens capturing the faint scratches on its surface. She clicked it open. He couldn't see the image inside from that angle, but he saw what she did. She raised the open locket to her lips and pressed a gentle kiss to it. Her eyes closed, and for a moment, her serene composure crumbled. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was a gesture of such profound, private grief that Kazuki felt like an intruder, a voyeur violating something sacred. He had seen men break under interrogation, seen fear and desperation in the eyes of his enemies, but he had never witnessed a sorrow so pure and silent. This was the secret. Not a conspiracy, not a hidden motive for wealth or power. Her secret was a wound that mirrored his own. He spent the next hour hacking into the agency that had placed her, cross-referencing public records, diving into a digital rabbit hole fueled by a desperate need to understand. He found it in a small-town online newspaper archive from 6 years ago. A short article about a tragic accident. A 7-year-old boy, Samuel, who had fallen from a riverside dock. The boy was described as having a severe developmental disorder. He was nonverbal. His older sister, who had been watching him, was named Lena. The shock wasn't that she had a tragic past. It was the chilling, heartbreaking symmetry of it. She wasn't just being kind to Haru. She was trying to atone. She was reaching out to the silent boy in this house because she couldn't save the silent boy from her past. Her patient, endless attempts to communicate were a penance, a desperate prayer sent across time to a ghost. Her kindness wasn't a tool, it was a scar. A fierce thunderstorm broke over the city that night, the kind that rattled the bones of the old mansion. Kazuki knew, even before he checked the monitors, that Haru would be terrified. The boy had an irrational fear of loud, sudden noises, a phantom echo of the crash that had stolen his hearing. On the screen, the scene in Haru's bedroom was exactly as he'd pictured. The boy was not in his bed but huddled in a corner, his small body coiled into a tight ball, hands pressed over his ears as if he could still hear the thunder's roar. Kazuki's first instinct was to go to him, to assert his presence, to command the fear away with the sheer force of his authority. It was how he solved every problem. But as he stood, he saw movement on another screen. It was Lena, hurrying down the hallway, her robe tied hastily around her. She hadn't been summoned. She must have heard the storm and simply known. He sat back down, his hand hovering over the intercom, and decided to wait. To watch. Lena entered Haru's room without a sound. The only light came from the intermittent flashes of lightning that illuminated the room in stark, ghostly white. She saw Haru in the corner and her movements became even slower, even more deliberate. She didn't rush to him, didn't try to gather him into an embrace. Kazuki watched, his breath held, as she did the most unexpected thing. She walked to the opposite corner of the room, sat on the floor, and curled herself into a ball, mirroring the boy's posture perfectly.
She didn't speak.
She didn't touch him. She simply joined him in his fear. She made herself small and vulnerable, a silent testament that he was not alone in the terrifying darkness. Then she began to hum. It was the same simple, wordless lullaby, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a sound offered to the room. It was a lifeline. Through the floorboards, through the very air in the room, the vibration traveled. It was a steady, calming pulse against the violent chaos of the storm outside. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, slowly, agonizingly, Haru began to uncurl. He lifted his head and looked across the room at the woman who was sharing his terror. He crawled, inch by inch, across the floor towards her. He didn't reach for her hands. He simply laid his head against her side, closing his eyes, pressing his cheek against her so he could feel the steady, rhythmic vibration of her humming. Lena wrapped one arm gently around his shoulders, and together, they rode out the storm. In his dark room, surrounded by his technology and his power, Kazuki felt a wall within himself crumble into dust. He had just witnessed an act of pure, unadulterated empathy, a language of the soul that he had never learned to speak. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and silent. The air in the mansion felt different, lighter. Kazuki found Lena the next evening in his study. She was polishing the dark mahogany of his desk, an object that had witnessed countless threats and ruthless negotiations. He had always been a shadow in the room, a presence behind the desk, but tonight he stood near the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. He let the silence stretch, a tactic he often used to unnerve his adversaries. But with her, it wasn't a tactic. It was a space he didn't know how to fill. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower than usual. "Why?" Lena stopped her work, her hand hovering over the wood. She looked at him, her expression calm but questioning.
He knew she didn't understand.
He had to be clearer, had to step onto a ground that felt foreign and unstable.
"Haru," he said.
"Why do you do it? The singing, the signs, the patience. You are paid to clean the house." She turned to face him fully, her gaze direct, without a trace of the deference or fear he was accustomed to. "Because no one should be that alone," she said simply. The answer was too simple, yet it held the weight of the world. "I know about your brother," Kazuki said, the words feeling like a betrayal of the grief he had witnessed. "Samuel." Lena's composure didn't break, but a shadow passed over her eyes, a flicker of the pain he'd seen on the monitor. She nodded slowly, her hands clasping the polishing cloth.
He was.
Quiet, she said, her voice soft. The world was too loud for him, I think. People tried to make him speak, doctors, therapists. They saw his silence as something to be fixed. But it was just his way. She looked past Kazuki, towards a garden, as if seeing a memory play out on the wet leaves. I was supposed to be watching him. I got distracted for a minute. Just 1 minute, her voice hitched, but she steadied it. I never heard him fall in. He couldn't call for me. I couldn't hear his silence over the noise of everything else. She finally looked back at Kazuki, and in her eyes, he saw not an employee, but an equal in loss. When I am with Haru, I try to listen to the silence. It's where he lives. I don't want to fix him. I just want him to know someone is there with him, listening. The next afternoon, for the first time in 2 years, Kazuki did not go to the surveillance room. He walked down the long, sunlit corridor to the playroom. The door was ajar. He could hear a faint, rhythmic humming from within. He pushed it open. Lena and Haru were sitting on the floor, a picture book of animals open between them. Lena was pointing to a picture of a bird, then slowly, gracefully, making the sign for fly, her hands fluttering like wings. Haru watched her, his expression one of rapt concentration. Neither of them noticed him at first. He stood in the doorway, a ghost in his own home, feeling more out of place than he ever had in a rival's territory. Lena finally looked up and saw him. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by her usual calm. She didn't scold him or question him. She simply gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Kazuki took a breath and stepped inside, his expensive leather shoes silent on the soft rug. He walked over and sat on the floor a few feet away from them. The action felt foreign, his suit stiff and unnatural. Haru's eyes widened, darting from his father to Lena and back again. Lena simply turned a page in the book. It showed a picture of a large, imposing bear. She looked at Kazuki, then at Haru, and then she formed the sign for father. A thumb tapped to the forehead. She held it there for a moment, her gaze soft and encouraging. She was inviting him in. Hesitantly, awkwardly, Kazuki raised his own hand and copied the gesture. He felt foolish, a powerful man playing a child's game. But then he looked at his son. Haru wasn't looking at his hand. He was looking at his face, his eyes searching his father's for the first time in a long, long time. Kazuki held the sign, his heart pounding a strange, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. Haru's gaze was intense. He opened his mouth. A small, dry, rasping sound emerged, like the rustle of dead leaves. T2, everyone in the room froze. The air grew thick with impossible hope. Haru's small hand lifted, reaching not for the book, but for Kazuki's face. His fingers brushed against his father's cheek. He took a shaky breath and tried again, his eyes locked with Kazuki's. Otozen, father. The word was a fragile whisper, a thread of sound in an ocean of silence, but it was a miracle. It shattered the stillness of the past 2 years. A single, hot tear escaped Kazuki's eye and traced a path through his stoic mask. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. The weeks that followed were a quiet renaissance. The heavy, oppressive silence of the mansion was gradually replaced by something new. It wasn't loud, but it was alive. It was the sound of Haru's hesitant voice, slowly forming words he hadn't spoken in years. Mizu, for water. Hana, for the flowers in the garden. Sora, for the sky he now watched with curious eyes. The surveillance room lay dormant, its screens dark and dusty. Kazuki no longer needed the cold, electronic eyes to connect with his son. He was present, truly present for the first time. He learned the clumsy dance of sign language, his powerful hands, once used to command and control, now used to shape words of love and encouragement in the air. He learned to listen not just with his ears, but with his heart, to the pauses between his son's words, to the emotions that flickered in his eyes. Lena was the quiet fulcrum of this new world. She was no longer just the maid, she was the architect of their healing. She guided Kazuki with gentle patience, teaching him how to play, how to be soft, how to step out of the role of the unassailable patriarch and into the vulnerable space of a father. She was the bridge between him and his son, and in doing so, she became the anchor of their small, unconventional family. One sunny afternoon, the three of them were in the garden. Haru, holding a bright red ball, was laughing. It was a real, unrestrained laugh, a sound so pure and beautiful that Kazuki felt his heart ache with joy. He threw the ball, and Haru chased after it, his small legs pumping. Kazuki watched him go, a sense of peace settling over him that no amount of wealth or power had ever provided. He turned to Lena, who was standing beside him, a soft smile on her face.
"Thank you," he said.
The words were inadequate, a pebble tossed into an ocean of gratitude. She simply nodded, her eyes on Haru. He had the words inside him all along, she said. He just needed to know it was safe to let them out. Kazuki looked from her to his son, and in that moment, he understood the profound truth of her statement. He had tried to build a fortress to keep the world out, but true safety wasn't about walls. It was about creating a space where a heart could feel secure enough to break open and heal. He had mistaken control for strength and surveillance for love. His greatest failure as a protector was not seeing that the most dangerous threat to his son wasn't a rival or an assassin. It was the crushing weight of loneliness. The cameras were still there, hidden in the walls, but they were just wires and glass now. Their power was gone. He was finally watching his son with his own eyes.